The reading of the will was supposed to be a formality, but it ended up being an eviction. For 15 years, 34-year-old Clara Whitmore had been the one with her hands in the dirt, keeping her aging father's farm running while her two older brothers built careers and families somewhere else. But when the paperwork was signed that April afternoon in a lawyer's office in Boone, North Carolina, Thomas and Dale walked out holding clear title to all 2,000 acres, every piece of equipment, and every dollar in the operating account. They gave Clara 48 hours to clear her things out of the house she'd spent a decade and a half keeping standing. With exactly $314 left to her name, Clara walked into the Watauga County Tax Office 3 days later and put $22 on the counter for the only parcel nobody else had bothered bidding on, a landlocked 3-acre ravine choked with 10-foot briars and old-growth hemlock nobody had touched in decades. Her oldest brother Thomas drove past the morning she went out to look at it, parked his truck on the shoulder, and laughed loud enough that she heard him over the wind. He told her she'd just spent her last dollar on a grave. 9 months later, as the May sun broke clean and warm across the valley, the laughing had stopped entirely. As you watch, see if you can figure out why the one thing that made that ravine worthless to everyone else in the county was the exact thing that ended up saving what was growing inside it. The lawyer's office had smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, and Clara remembered thinking, sitting in a hard chair between her two brothers, that her father would have hated dying in a room that smelled like that. He'd died on the farm itself, in the front bedroom, with Clara holding his hand through the worst of the last night, and neither Thomas nor Dale had made it back from wherever they were living in time to see any of it. The will split everything between the two of them. Clara got a small cash sum, and, from Thomas, a version of generosity that felt worse than nothing at all. "You can stay on," he told her, standing in the kitchen the next morning, arms crossed the way he did when he thought he was being reasonable. $200 a month, room and board. You keep doing the chickens and the garden like always. It's not like we're throwing you out on the street. Dale stood by the window, not quite meeting her eyes, the way he'd avoided most confrontations his whole life, by simply letting Thomas do the talking for both of them. He'd been the one, 15 years earlier, who'd told Clara she was better suited to staying home with their father than either of them were, softer about it than Thomas. But the outcome had been the same either way. "You are, though," Clara said. "You're just dressing it up as a job offer. Clara, be reasonable. Somebody's got to run this place like a real operation now. You know how to keep books and grow tomatoes. That's not the same as running 2,000 acres. I've been running 2,000 acres for the last 4 years, Thomas. Since Daddy's hands got too bad to hold a wrench. You just weren't here to see it." He didn't have anything to say to that, and the silence that followed was worse than any argument would have been. Dale finally spoke, quiet, still not looking at her directly. "Nobody's trying to hurt you, Clara. You don't have to try," she said. "It just happens anyway, when you don't think about somebody at all." She packed what fit in her truck that same afternoon: clothes, her father's old tools, and a canvas satchel that had belonged to her mother's grandmother, a woman named Ada Pruitt, that Clara had kept in a closet for years without ever fully going through it, and drove into town before the second day of her 48 hours had even finished. The auction took 4 minutes. Clara sat in a mostly empty room while a county clerk read off parcel numbers nobody wanted, delinquent taxes on land too small, too steep, or too overgrown to interest anyone with real money to spend. Lot 14, Section B came up near the bottom of the list. 3 acres, landlocked, accessible only by an old logging track, assessed value low enough that the opening bid was the full amount owed in back taxes. $22. Nobody else raised a hand. Clara didn't fully know why she raised hers, sitting there with $314 to her name and nowhere yet to sleep. That wasn't her truck. Maybe because it was the first thing in her whole life that nobody could take back from her at a kitchen table with their arms crossed. She drove out to see it 2 days later, and it looked worse in person than the tax map had suggested. Briars taller than she was, young cedar choking what might once have been a path, the black-green shade of old hemlock so thick overhead that midday light barely made it to the ground. An elderly neighbor named Ruth Pemberton, working her own fence line a quarter-mile off, waved her down before she'd gotten far. "You're the Whitmore girl," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Bought the old Pruitt ravine, did you?" Clara went still. "The what?" "Pruitt ravine. Belonged to your mother's people, way back, before my time, even, but my own mother used to talk about it. Family lost it during the hard years, 30s I believe. Taxes same as you just paid, funny enough. Nobody's touched it since. Man who bought it off the county back, then never so much as cleared a path through it. Just let it sit. Clara stood there a long moment, briars at her back, understanding for the first time that the piece of ground she'd bought out of pure defiance had once belonged to her own family. Generations before her brother's side of the family had ever owned a single acre of the farm they'd just taken from her. She drove back to her truck slower than usual that evening, turning the coincidence over the whole way. Nobody had ever told her a single word about a Pruitt ravine, not her mother before her own death years earlier, not any of the aunts and cousins scattered through the county who still gathered at Thanksgiving out of habit more than closeness. Whatever had happened to this land in the 30s had apparently been painful enough, or simply distant enough, that the family had let it slip out of conversation entirely, the way land lost to debt so often does. Not spoken of, not mourned openly, just quietly absorbed into the long list of things a family decides isn't worth bringing up anymore. Clara had bought it back for $22 without knowing any of that history existed, and something about the timing of it. Coming exactly when her brothers had made clear there was no place left for her on the only ground she'd ever called home, felt too precise to be pure accident. She went through Ada Pruitt's satchel properly for the first time that same week, sitting on her truck's tailgate with the ravine at her back. Most of it was ordinary, a cracked hand mirror, a few buttons, a folded letter too faded to read fully. But near the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a small leather notebook, its cover soft and cracked, dated in careful, looping handwriting, 1932. Most of the entries were about weather, about the price of things, about a husband Clara's research would later confirm had died young, leaving Ada to hold the family's remaining ground together alone through the worst of the Depression. One entry, near the middle, stopped Clara cold. Bankman came again today. Told him nothing. Took the peony roots and the good dahlia stock down to the east bank of the ravine tonight after dark. Dug them in 18 inches under the old hemlocks where the ground never truly freezes. They sleep until we need them. Nobody digs where nobody thinks to look. Clara read it 3 times, sitting in the fading light with briars all around her, before she let herself believe what it was actually telling her. She didn't have the money for equipment, so she bought a used steel brush hook for $14 from a hardware store 2 towns over and started clearing by hand, a little at a time, through the rest of that spring and into summer. The work was slow enough to be almost meditative some mornings and simply brutal on others. Thorns thick enough to tear through work gloves within a week, her palms blistered raw by the second month. Poison ivy she didn't identify in time twice. For the first 6 weeks, she slept in the truck, parked at the head of the old logging track, telling herself it was temporary right up until it stopped feeling temporary at all. She found a room to rent above a feed store in town eventually, cheap enough to manage on what little cash she'd kept back, small enough that she could hear the owner's dog pacing the floor below most nights. She drove out to the ravine before work most mornings and again after, however many daylight hours she could steal from whatever odd bookkeeping jobs she'd picked up around the county to keep herself fed, while the land gave her nothing back yet but blisters. She kept her own notebook, the way Ada had, mostly out of habit at first. 10 feet, cleared today. Found an old fence post, rotted through. Rain again. Ground here holds water longer than anywhere else on the property, even the high ground. By late spring she'd cleared enough of a perimeter to run a simple wire fence around the eastern section, mostly to keep deer off whatever ended up growing there, salvaging what posts she could from the old rotted line and buying the rest a few at a time as she could afford them. She borrowed a neighbor's small tiller for a single weekend to break ground on what would become her first planting beds outside the original buried clusters. Nothing fancy. Just enough turned soil to test whether the ravine could support new stock alongside whatever Ada had left behind decades earlier. The tiller was too heavy for the slope in places, and she ended up finishing 2 of the beds by hand with a garden fork instead, glad afterward that she had, since the handwork ground held together better once the rains came than the sections the machine had chewed through too fast. June bled into July, and July into a wet, close August that turned the ravine into something almost tropical in its density. Gnats thick enough to breathe in if she wasn't careful, the smell of crushed green stems, and turned earth, following her back to the truck every evening, no matter how many times she tried to wash it off her hands first. She learned the rhythm of the place slowly, the way any land teaches a person who's willing to keep showing up. Which slopes held mud longest after a storm? Where the hemlock canopy broke just enough to let a shaft of real sun through at midday, and where it never broke at all. The particular quality of silence down in the ravine bottom, thick enough some mornings that she could hear her own heartbeat before the birds started up properly. Her hands changed that summer in ways she hadn't expected, callus building over callus until the blisters mostly stopped forming at all, her body slowly remembering work it hadn't done since she was young enough to help her father clear fence line as a girl. She lost weight, she didn't have much spare to lose. She also, for the first time since her father's decline had begun years earlier, started sleeping through most nights without waking. There was a stretch in late July when the heat sat over the ravine thick enough to make even the shaded ground feel airless, and Clara spent 3 straight days clearing brush that revealed nothing underneath it but more brush, no stones, no sign at all that Ada's notebook was pointing her toward anything real rather than an old woman's fading memory of a plan that had never actually been carried out. She sat on a fallen log that third evening, arms scratched raw, genuinely doubting for the first time since the auction whether she'd spent her last $22 on anything more than a very large, very thorny hole to bury herself in exactly the way Thomas had predicted. She thought seriously, that evening, about whether it was too late to find real work somewhere else in the county and let the ravine go quietly back to what it had been for the 90 years before she showed up. She went back out the next morning anyway, mostly because she didn't have anywhere else worth going instead. By August, she'd cleared enough of the east bank to see the ground itself clearly for the first time. Dark, rich soil, leaf mold built up undisturbed for the better part of a century, cooler and damper under her boots than anywhere else on the whole 3 acres. Her brush hook caught on something in early September that wasn't root or rock. She knelt and cleared dirt away by hand until she'd exposed a line of field stones, stacked with deliberate care, running along the base of the slope exactly where Ada's notebook had described. She dug carefully from there, 18 inches down exactly as instructed, and found them. Tuber clusters, dormant, some larger than dinner plates, preserved in cold, undisturbed earth for nearly a century. She sat back on her heels in the dirt a long while, hands shaking slightly, before she trusted herself to touch them again. She didn't dig them all up. Something about Ada's own restraint in that single notebook entry, bury them, let them sleep, nobody digs where nobody thinks to look, made Clara want to earn whatever came next rather than rush it. She cleared brush carefully around the buried clusters instead, letting filtered light reach soil that hadn't seen real sun in decades, mulching with fallen leaves the way her instinct told her Ada would have. Across the fence line, Thomas and Dale were running 2,000 acres of commodity, corn the way modern operations ran everything. Heavy equipment, bulldozed tree lines, synthetic fertilizer poured on by the ton to force yield out of ground that had been worked hard for 3 generations straight. Clara could hear their equipment some evenings, a low constant grind that never once slowed for anything. Winter came on hard that year, the ravine going quiet and gray under bare branches, the tuber clusters resting undisturbed beneath their blanket of mulched leaves the same way they'd rested for the 90 years before Clara ever found them. She kept working through the cold months anyway, clearing more of the western edge in fits and starts, repairing an old section of the logging track that had washed out, learning the shape of the whole 3 acres in a season when nothing was actively growing and there was nothing left to do but pay closer attention. She read Ada's notebook cover to cover more than once that winter, by lamplight in her rented room above the feed store, piecing together a life that had survived a husband's early death and a bank's persistent letters through nothing more than stubbornness and a garden nobody else believed in. By March, the first green shoots had started pushing up through the mulch on the eastern bank, tentative at first, easy to miss if a person wasn't looking closely enough to know what they meant. That same month, Clara drove out to the county agricultural extension office to register the ravine as a small working farm, mostly for the tax classification, but partly, she admitted to herself, because putting a name to what she was building made it feel more real. The extension agent, a soft-spoken man who'd spent 30 years helping small growers across the county sort out everything from soil testing to planting schedules, walked her through what qualified as agricultural use on 3 acres this size. Flower cultivation counted the same as any other crop, he told her, provided she kept records of what she planted, what she harvested, and what came in from sales each season. She left that afternoon with a folder of planting guides and estate agricultural numbers stapled to the front of her own notebook, and something about seeing Whitmore Farm typed out on an official county form did more to settle her nerves about the whole venture than anything else had that entire winter. It wasn't 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans. It was 3 acres of ground her own family had once farmed and lost, registered now under her name alone, with a harvest still months away and no guarantee yet that any of it would come to anything. The frost came in early April, 11 months after she'd bought the land. Earlier and harder than any forecast had predicted. A sudden, brutal cold snap dropping temperatures into the mid-20s for 2 nights running. The kind of late freeze that catches an entire valley by surprise once every decade or so. Clara hadn't finished clearing the western edge of the ravine yet, and in her eagerness to give that section more light for the coming season, she'd taken down more of the old canopy there than she should have. She heard the forecast on the truck radio driving back from town that first afternoon and spent the next several hours in a growing panic, calling every feed store and hardware supplier within 20 miles trying to find enough row cover fabric to matter, most of them already sold out to farmers with far more acreage and far more warning than she'd had. She spent both nights of the freeze out in the ravine with what blankets and old bed sheets she could scrape together, working by flashlight in air cold enough to hurt her lungs, tucking cover over shoots that were already too far along to fully protect. Somewhere past 2 in the morning on the second night, hands numb even through gloves, she understood she was losing a fight she'd started too late to actually win. It wasn't enough. She lost nearly a third of that season's new growth on the exposed western edge. Tender shoots blackened and collapsed by morning. Tubers she'd have to wait another full year to see recover, if they recovered at all. She sat on the cold ground that second morning and cried for a while, alone, nobody to see it, grieving something she couldn't get back no matter how carefully she worked from here forward. She thought, sitting there, about Thomas telling her she'd bought herself a grave, and how close that morning had come to feeling like proof he'd been right. But the eastern section, still shaded by the oldest hemlocks she hadn't cleared, came through both nights almost entirely unmarked. A cousin of her mother's, a woman named Sherry Pruitt Combs who Clara had met maybe twice growing up, called her that same week, having heard through some branch of the extended family grapevine that Clara had bought back a piece of the old Pruitt ground. Sherry didn't have much to add to what Ruth had already told her. The family had simply stopped talking about the ravine generations back, the way families do with land lost to hard years, until it became one of those facts nobody actively hid, but nobody volunteered either. Grandma Ada used to say the prettiest things always grew where nobody else thought to look, Sherry told her, over a phone line with static enough that Clara had to ask her to repeat it once. Always figured that was just something old women say. Maybe it wasn't. Clara didn't have folders of family photographs or a long written history to offer back, just the notebook and the ground itself, and whatever she'd managed to coax out of both since the previous spring. It was enough, apparently, for Sherry, who promised to visit sometime that summer once the flowers were up properly, a promise Clara noted down in the same notebook, where she kept everything else that mattered that year. It took her most of that week to understand why. Driving into town to ask a retired county forester named Hollis Greer, who ran a small consulting business out of his garage and had a reputation for knowing more about mountain microclimates than anyone with an actual degree in it. Hollis walked the ravine slowly, looking up more than down, quiet for long enough that Clara started to wonder if he was going to tell her anything useful at all. Your instinct to clear for more light wasn't wrong, generally speaking, he finally said. Just wrong for a frost night specifically. Open ground loses heat straight up into a clear night sky. That's basic radiative cooling. Same reason a frost forms on your windshield even when the air temperature's a few degrees above freezing. Canopy like these old hemlocks traps that heat close to the ground instead of letting it escape. That's why your shaded section held. It wasn't luck. It was exactly the thing that made this ravine look worthless to everybody else for 80 years. And the creek? Clara asked, nodding toward the thin spring-fed trickle running along the ravine's bottom, the one she'd cleared debris from back in June mostly out of tidiness. Moving water resists freezing harder than still air does. Releases a little heat as it cools, keeps the immediate area around it a few degrees warmer than open ground. Not dramatic. But on a night that's only a couple degrees past the edge, a couple degrees is the whole ballgame. Hollis looked at her a long moment. Whoever originally chose to bury anything valuable in this exact spot, generations back, they weren't guessing. They knew this ground held heat other ground around here didn't. Clara thought about Ada, digging in the dark by lantern light. Choosing this exact bank under these exact trees for a reason she'd apparently understood without ever needing anyone to explain the physics of it to her. The same freeze that cost Clara a third of one season's new growth on her exposed western edge did far worse across the fence line. Thomas and Dale's 2,000 acres, cleared decades earlier of every tree line that might have slowed wind or held heat near the ground, took the frost with nothing standing between the crop and a clear, merciless sky. Corn already up from an early planting was destroyed almost entirely across their lowest fields. The same open, efficient ground that had always been the operation's proudest asset turning, for 2 nights, into its single greatest liability. Clara heard about it the way she heard most things now, secondhand through Ruth Pemberton, who didn't seem to take any particular pleasure in delivering the news, just reported it the way she reported most things, plainly. Lost near 60 acres of their earliest corn, Ruth said. Heard Thomas about put his fist through a wall over it. Clara didn't feel triumphant hearing it. Mostly she just thought about her own blackened shoots on the western edge and understood, in a way she hadn't fully let herself before, that losing things to weather wasn't a special cruelty reserved just for her. The blooming, when it finally came in May, arrived faster and more completely than Clara had let herself expect. 9 months almost to the week since she'd first put $22 on a county clerk's counter, the undisturbed eastern section of the ravine broke open all at once. Heirloom peonies in shades she hadn't seen in any nursery catalog, deep coral and near black red, and a white, so pure it looked lit from within, dahlias close behind them, massive blooms on stems thick as her thumb. The whole eastern bank suddenly heavy with color where 11 months earlier there had been nothing but briars and blackshade. The smell of it reached her before she was even fully down the slope that first morning. Something rich and slightly sweet. Carried on cool air still pooled low in the ravine the way it did most mornings, even in May. Bees had already found it, working steadily from bloom to bloom in numbers she hadn't seen anywhere else on the property. And somewhere above the canopy a pair of cardinals kept up a call and answer that seemed, that particular morning, almost too perfectly timed to the moment to be entirely coincidence. She stood at the edge of it the first full morning, coffee going cold in her hand, and didn't fully trust what she was looking at for several minutes. She walked the length of the eastern bank slowly, touching petals like she half expected them to prove themselves fake under her fingers, and then sat down right there in the damp grass and let herself feel, for the first time in almost a year, something that wasn't exhaustion or grief or careful, guarded hope. She thought, sitting there, about her father, about the particular quiet way he used to walk his own fields at dawn before anyone else was awake, and understood that whatever this ravine had just given her, it had been growing toward this exact morning for longer than she'd been alive to witness any of it. Word moved slowly at first, the way it does in a county that size. A photograph Clara posted more out of pride than any business plan, shared by someone who knew someone at a floral wholesaler 2 counties over. Then, faster. A woman named Priscilla Doan, who ran a small but well-regarded flower shop in Asheville, drove out the second week of blooming, walked the cleared paths Clara had cut through the ravine with something close to disbelief on her face, and crouched beside one of the darkest red peonies for a long moment, without saying anything at all. I haven't seen this variety outside a photograph in a botanical archive, Priscilla finally said. Where did you even get stock like this? It was already here, Clara said. Buried, actually. Since 1932. Priscilla looked up at her like she wasn't sure whether to believe the story or simply let it go, and asked, plainly, how many stems Clara could realistically cut without damaging the plants for next season. Clara didn't know the market well enough yet to name a number with any confidence. Priscilla suggested $12 a stem for the rarest coral variety, apologetically, as though she expected Clara to counter higher. Clara didn't know enough yet to know that was already a strong price, and said yes. Over the following 3 weekends, working carefully, cutting only what the plants could spare, and leaving the rest to establish deeper roots for seasons still to come, Clara sold enough stems to deposit $14,600 into an account that had held less than $300 less than a year earlier. She sat in her truck after the 3rd weekend's delivery and looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time before she trusted it enough to drive home. She set up a small table at the county farmers market that same June, mostly on impulse, a modest bucket of stems she hadn't sold to Priscilla's shop propped up beside a hand-lettered sign reading Whitmore Farm, heirloom flowers. Other growers around her sold sweet corn and tomatoes and early squash, the ordinary rhythm of a rural county's growing season laid out table to table, and Clara found herself explaining more than once that afternoon that no, she wasn't a vegetable farm, she grew flowers, an answer that seemed to surprise more than one longtime customer who'd known the Whitmore name only in connection with corn and cattle. She sold out of stems within 2 hours, and drove home that evening with an empty bucket and a list of names on a notepad, people asking to be told when the next cutting would be ready. Thomas came down to the ravine's edge himself in early June, alone this time, no truck parked dramatically on the shoulder, just walking the old logging track on foot until he reached the spot where he'd once told her she'd bought herself a grave. He didn't say anything for a while, looking at color that had no business existing on ground he genuinely believed was worthless 11 months earlier. "We lost 60 acres to that April freeze," he finally said. "Insurance covers some of it. Not all. I heard." This, he gestured at the blooms without finishing the sentence, the way a man gestures at something he doesn't have adequate words for. "How?" Clara told him about Ada, about the notebook, about hemlock canopy and radiative frost and a spring-fed creek that had been quietly doing the same job for nearly a century before anyone remembered to ask it to. Thomas listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual enough that Clara noticed. "Dale and I talked," he said eventually. "We'd buy this section back. Fair price. More than fair, actually, given what you paid." "I know what it's worth, Thomas." "That's not really the question." "Then what is?" Clara looked out at the ravine, the eastern section thriving, the scarred western edge slowly recovering, the creek still running quiet underneath all of it. 9 months ago, I had $314 and nowhere to sleep that wasn't my own truck. I spent 22 of it on the one piece of ground in this whole county nobody thought was worth having. I'm not selling it back to the people who made sure I needed to buy it in the first place." Thomas didn't have an answer for that. He stood a while longer, looking at color neither he nor Dale had believed could ever come out of that particular ground, and then he left without the deed and without much more to say. Dale never came down to the ravine himself, not that summer and not the one after. Clara heard, through Ruth again, that he'd told someone at the feed store the whole thing made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully explain. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to the specific discomfort of watching a decision he'd once been part of turn out to matter more than he'd ever imagined it could. She didn't go looking for a conversation with him. Some things, she decided, didn't need forcing before either person was ready for them. Clara kept the original auction receipt, $22, Lot 14, Section B, county stamp faded but legible, tucked into the same notebook where she now recorded every harvest, every frost date, every stem she cut, and every root she left undisturbed for another season. It sat a few pages behind Ada's own handwriting, decades apart, the same careful attention to exactly how much a person could take from a piece of ground without ever taking too much. The western edge came back slowly the following spring, thinner than the eastern section but recovering, canopy filling back in overground. Clara had learned, the hard way, not to clear too aggressively again. Sherry made good on her promise that August, driving 3 hours to walk the ravine herself, standing a long while at the fieldstone line before saying much of anything. The same quiet the whole family seemed to fall into whenever they finally stood on ground that had waited 2 generations to be claimed back. The land hadn't made Clara wealthy overnight, and she'd stopped expecting it to. What it had given her first, before any of the money, was something her brother's 2,000 acres and every dollar in that estate account had never managed to hand her at any point in 15 years of work. A piece of ground nobody could tell her she didn't deserve. If a story like this, where the land nobody else wanted turns out to be exactly the ground someone in your own family once trusted with everything that mattered most, is the kind of thing that stays with you. Subscribe. And if you've ever built something real out of the one thing everyone around you was sure was worthless, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.